I've said it before and I will say it again, thank you very, very much for choosing to spend some of your Thursday afternoon with us, especially here on the final week of the semester for our CLA Research Thursday series. We have a kind of a special guest with us tonight, this afternoon. Not only is he going to present something excellent to you, but I believe it's also his birthday today.
Happy birthday.
So that's kind of special. Yay, congratulations. That doesn't mean that we should not give him very difficult questions and comparisons, which I'm sure he would relish that challenge, but be that as it may. So that I don't take up any time at the end, let me just remind you, this is our last of this series of presentations for this semester. We will boot up again next January 31st with Michael Sonfrank from the Department of Communication. Before we get there, however, let me please welcome David Beard from the Department of Writing Studies to talk about definition and ideology, the new rhetoric, not the old rhetoric, i.e. Richard Weaver and the current research on definition. David Beard.
So the purpose of the presentation, first of all, to give you some summary of the chapter of the book I'm working on, to validate the receipt of the McKnight Award, which is why there's a little camera in the back saying hello. To lure students, and there are a lot more here than I expected, and I'm worried that the ones who are registered for my classes are going to be measuring my college points against how I grade theirs, into my kind of research, and to initiate some conversation. The slide filled with thanks is for everybody who's been helpful in this project. It's at the beginning because I thought people might want to sneak out to see Dr. Maiolo after a certain point, so if you do, I wanted to start with an initial basic description because one of my colleagues in the Department of Writing Studies and I had this fascinating conversation about a year and a half ago in which she said, rhetoric is what I try to eliminate from my students' writing. And that's working on a definition of rhetoric, which is ornate language, which is unnecessarily complex language. And so I have a couple of, I guess, stipulative definitions of rhetoric that help you understand what I mean when I use the term if you're working with a different definition. So this is one borrowed from folks in communication studies, from a guy named Donald Bryant, the study of the behavior of people and people to ideas. And what I'd like to do is complement that with a couple of others, give you a sense of the scope of what I'm working on. And so this is from a woman named Krista Radcliffe, who teaches English in Milwaukee, and she calls it the study of how we use language and how language uses us. It's similar in structure to what Brian says, but there are some nuances and meaning that I want to make sure you kind of see so that we're not talking about language rhetoric here. And James Berlin, who is in many ways the father of all I think I know about rhetoric, says rhetoric has a base, a conception of reality, of human nature, and of language. And so if you have an understanding of what rhetoric is, you have an understanding of all these things. Next slide is a long elaboration of that, which you can look at on your own if you have one of the handouts. But what I want to point to, that's my weather club. So if there's a terrible storm coming, it's going to buzz at us. Rhetoric is thus ultimately implicated in all of society attempts. It is the center of a culture's activities, and this is one of those lucky accidents of Google Images. When you type in rhetoric and you look at Google Images, both of these popped up on the first search page, which is just a wonderful juxtaposition to talk about how rhetoric influences the highest of our discourse and the most mundane. My own little spin here. I want to make sure that you understand that when I talk about rhetoric, I'm talking about it as both a hermeneutic and heuristic art, an interpretive and a productive art, an epistemic and persuasive art, an art of gnosis and practice. It's reading and writing, both speaking and listening. The historical period that my research focuses on is called the New Rhetoric. The catch-all for an interdisciplinary international group of scholars writing between, say, 1900 and 1945 and 1955. Writing in literature, composition, speech communication, and philosophy. They included people like I. Richards, the subject of my book, Kenneth Burke, an American literary critic, Chaim Perlman, a Belgian philosopher, Stephen Toulmin, an English philosopher, Richard Weaver, an American teacher of English at the University of Chicago, and later folks in the Flint booth. So hopefully one of those names rings a bell with most people in the room. The other term that's in the title of my talk that I want to make sure you identify is ideology. And there are two kinds of definitions of figures. There are more definitions for ideology than I have digits, but I want to use two to set up an opposition here. One of them is the idea of a science of ideas in the 18th century. The idea of an ideology was simply a system of ideas that you have in your mind, a particularly harmless definition as envisioned by the French guys who developed it. And then there is a more revolutionary definition, a collection of ideas with certain internal logical structure, which can be identified as the creation of some identifiable group, political, cultural, economic, for purposes of maintaining their own interests. So if I say that there is a dominant ideology, it means that there may be a class of people who have a set of ideas, and they convince other people to buy into it. And by buying into it, it reinscribes or reinstates the power of the people who invented that system of ideas. And this is, for me, the important part. An ideology creates the assumption that the dominance by a certain sector of society is natural and desirable. So, if I believe that if I buy into an ideology, in some ways I may be buying into the idea that the people who are in charge, whether it's of the political structures, the economic structures, are supposed to be in charge. And that's the kind of sneaky, subversive understanding of ideology. And I tried to come up with an example of something that might illustrate a way to naturalize relationships of power. And I knew that one of the graduate students who's interested in medieval studies was here, so you probably know this better than I do. But the great chain of being, the understanding that at the bottom there are plants and animals building their ways up to humans and angels and eventually to God, in a kind of system of orders and beings in the Middle Ages that constitutes a kind of ideology because it locates people within a system of thought and gives us a certain position. If you can't make it out from that picture, this is a little bit clearer one. So humans are right about here, God's up here, and stones are down there. Does this ring a few bells? I do that a lot with all my students who really hate me because I keep asking. And if somebody nods, I keep them. And I like to juxtapose this with the idea of feudalism, because feudalism, the idea of serfs on the bottom, nobles and the clergy at the top, seems to me a different way of organizing society in a way which is mapping onto the idea of the great chain of being, which is to say if there's a natural order of intelligence and life forms within the level that humans occupy, there may be also a similar differentiation. Either this example made the idea of ideology clearer or less clear. The question that drives me, how does one's understanding of ideology reflect one's theory of rhetoric? And the specific historical question that motivates me is how does the developing theory of ideology reflect the historical period, inflect the historical period called New Rhetoric? Which is to say, between 1900 and 1950, there were lots of changes in what people understood ideology to mean. And it's my take that those changes are reflected in changes in rhetorical theory at the time. The lens for this, how many of you panicked with me? No? Okay. It's my understanding that if we look at how these different theorists of rhetoric understood definition at this time period, that's the lens that will show us the changing understanding of ideology as it's reflected in the theory. And so the lens for this talk is how people wrote about definition. And I chose the fuzzy slide because I'm still working some of this stuff out.